So now we know about the major parts of a trailer, and now we need to take a little bit of a deeper dive to understand how a trailer works and some of the things that could go wrong. Not so that you're terrified, but just so that you're informed. And when you talk about things that can go wrong, as I have with engineers, particularly engineers devoted to road safety called VAS engineers in Victoria, they are the engineers that make assessments as to whether a vehicle is safe to travel according to the VSB1 for trailers, Vehicle Standard Bulletin 1. The last version was in 2009. They are working on a new version of the VSB1. It's good to know who's in charge and who to look to for how to make a safe trailer. In Victoria, it's called the Vehicle Assessment Signatory Scheme, or VAS engineers. There is no obligation when you're building a trailer to consult with a VAS engineer. Literally anybody can make a trailer that's rated to less than 4.5 ton, and literally anyone does. I mentioned to you the suspensions before. I saw on Gumtree somebody who had a triaxle trailer and had used an eye and slipper suspension for each one of those axles. An eye and slipper suspension is non-load sharing. Now, it doesn't not meet the VSB1. It meets the VSB1, is totally impractical, a very poor design, and yet, you know, you as a consumer, unless you knew what you were talking about, and you looked under there and said, hey, that's not a load-sharing suspension, you could be very vulnerable. So the point here is that even though we're not obligated to consult VAS engineers, we really should, and we have. So these are the names given for a VAS engineer, that's a Victorian term, in other states. Here's our list of things that could go wrong and why Backyard Bob may not be your best option for building your trailer. Let's talk about stopping. First of all, you have your mechanical brake. This is a steel cable that engages the brake mechanically. Now, you never want to rely on it entirely. You do want to chock the wheels, so that's another braking system. There's the chocking of the wheels, and there's the mechanical cable brake. Oh, this is not when it's moving, just when it's parked up. So that's 1 and 2. The third way is a brake controller. Now, it lives in your tow vehicle. You need an auto electrician to put it in. And what it does is it coordinates the brake pedal in the tow vehicle, activating the brakes on your trailer. So that as you press on the brake here, the brake controller will give braking at the rear. This is important because we want to have the brakes on the trailer pulling back on that tow vehicle so that we all stay in a nice straight line. If you have something really heavy behind you, it's pushing on the back of that vehicle, and you don't want to be trying to stop all of this just with your brakes on your tow vehicle. Because what you're asking these brakes to do is to stop this massive weight that's pushing on the back of your tow vehicle, and it's going to want a jackknife, you know, and this is not good for us. We want to stop in a nice straight line, so we want to have the tow vehicle pulling us in a nice slow coordinated stop, a nice controlled stop in a straight line. So the brake controller is for the normal stopping that you would do with a tiny house. There's one more braking system. It's the emergency braking system. This is a system that activates the brakes on your tiny house to act independently of the tow vehicle. It would be for if your tow vehicle and your tiny house became separated. This is a system that activates the brakes on your tiny house to act independently of the tow vehicle. This is how it works. A pin gets pulled and activates the battery on your tiny house, and that battery charge activates the electric brakes and slows and stops the tiny house, even if it's not connected to the tow vehicle and you don't have the benefit of that brake controller or the brakes on the tiny house. This is heavy and it's right behind you. You do not want it running you down. You don't want it to be moving faster than you are. And the emergency braking system, the breakaway system, is the system that we use to stop in case of a catastrophe and they become separated. So, tow ball weight. That's the downward pressure at the tow ball. And look, a picture's worth 1,000 words. Here's a picture. There's some debate academically amongst people who look at this about what is the ideal tow ball weight. And often you'll hear in Australia in particular 10% as a rule of thumb, and it's still a good rule of thumb. But if you look at some of the research papers, there is some indication that it's more like 6 to 8% is an ideal tow ball weight. You don't want to be too light on your tow ball, because if you're too light, you know, bouncy road, you come off somehow, this is not good. You know, you don't want these things traveling separately, and this is heavy and moving fast right behind you, not something you want. So basically you want to have a positive weight downward on the back on that tow ball for safety. And you don't want it to be too heavy, because if you get too much tow ball weight, it lifts the front end up. And this means you can no longer direct and steer you. This is bad news. So you might be wondering, well, how do I get my tow ball weight? How do I know what my overall weight is? Well, you find a public weighbridge and you bring everything onto the weighbridge, and the back wheels of your tow vehicle are off the scale, right? So imagine a scale sitting here, and you bring your tiny house right there. You use your jack stand here. You lift lift it off of the ball so that the whole weight of the tiny house is on the scale. Now that is the number that you compare with the ATM. That all-up weight has to be less than your ATM. So that's the all-up weight of your tiny house. But you might be wanting to know, well, what is my tow ball weight? Well, it's a very quick subtraction problem. Once you get the all-up weight, then you put the tiny house back onto the tow vehicle completely and get that weight. Just have them note it down. And the difference between that weight and the all-up weight is your tow ball weight. Okay, I look ridiculous, but for a point, a good cause. These are axles, these are tires, this is the drawbar, the A-frame, and this is my tow vehicle here. This is the box of the trailer. Hopefully you can see that the axles are in the dead center of the green box of the trailer. That means it would be right at the balance point, and that's not good enough, because if we're very much at the balance point, it's likely that it's going to lift off of the tow vehicle. So what we need to do is to shift the axle group back this way. This is dead center, and we go back. The axle group goes back. For a 6-meter trailer, that's 250 mil. For a 7.2 meter trailer, it's 300 mil. The formula is that for every foot of length of the box, it goes back from the center line of the box ½ an inch. 250 mil, 300 mil, that's really not much. You don't want to go too much. If you go all the way back, you increase the tow ball weight dramatically. Plus it just looks bad. So it's a bit like Goldilocks. Just right. Not too hot, not too cold, not too heavy, not too light, but sensible weight distribution. Wheel guard clearance is something that we've talked about already, And what we want to guard against is having this distance get too close together. Here's a great image about how things can go wrong, where it does actually kiss. And you can see in this image, the tire kisses the top of the wheel guard. So load sharing suspensions, we've talked about that. If you're not quite sure what I've been talking about, study this image and it'll become clear. Sadly, not every tiny house builder really knows what they're doing. And it does take some practice and some planning ahead. Now, one thing that can go wrong is that they build a beautiful tiny house, but you can't get the wheels off. This is a problem. You can't cover up your access to your tires. Why do you need access to your tires? So that you can change them. And if you can't change your tires, you have it's not roadworthy and it's really unsafe. If your tire goes, you got to be able to change that tire. Don't have a tiny house design that impedes that in any way. So this next little bit might seem a little bit technical, but you'll pick it up. And even a layperson, after I finish, you'll be able to tell if this is happening with the trailer that you have in mind. So with welding, whenever you weld two bits of steel together, you actually weaken the steel at that point. Now you've made a strong connection, but you've actually introduced a lot of heat and energy into it, and it's actually weakened at that point. And this is why when the connection between the box of the trailer and the drawbar, this is a potential area of weakness. Now you never want to weld across the drawbar because this is what can happen. In this image you can see where the weakness is in that drawbar. Now if you weld across in that direction, you've helped to weaken it. So what you do is you weld from underneath in the direction of travel, always in the direction of travel, never across the drawbar. Another thing that can go wrong with tiny house trailer design is that the drawbar needs to be long enough to put the things that you want on that drawbar when it's parked up. So it needs to be long enough to do those things and not too short, so that when your tiny house vehicle that you're towing it with doesn't turn in and damage either the thing that's on your drawbar or the tiny house itself when it's doing a turn. So plan on your design being able to jackknife the tiny house completely, and you don't have any part of the tow vehicle and the tiny house collide. This is a great use of SketchUp. You can do that modeling in SketchUp. So with trailers, you really have three options about how you're going to acquire your trailer. You can buy a new one, you can buy a used one and rehabilitate it, or you can weld a new one up from scratch yourself. So when you're weighing up these options, these are some things to think about. Let's just call them risks.